Every Thanksgiving, a friend comes to mind that I met in 1999 in Mexico City in the DF, el Distrito Federal. Hector, he was a Mexican-Canadian guy, and I was happy that I actually knew more Spanish than Hector. A lot of my good friends over the years, they're a little bit funnier than I am, and some of you might say, well, that's not hard to do. But Hector was funny, and so we got along really, really well. And Hector, for the first time in my consciousness, now this is 20 years ago, he said, when I get a big meal, my family goes around the whole house looking for me. And I get what I call a food coma. And I don't know why they look around the house, because every Thanksgiving I can be found right under the table. He said, I just go to sleep right under the table. So every Thanksgiving, my mind will go at one point to Hector and his food coma. Because we were like in disbelief. You're not serious. He said, I'm serious. Right under the table. Food coma, right there. So did you guys have food coma this week? A little bit? Some of you at home, you're still in a food coma. I know that's why you didn't come to church. Be honest. The rest of us, we had our spouses use wheelbarrows to, get us out of the house. Anyway, today we are going to change direction again. I know that you are still stuffing your stomachs with a little bit of leftovers, and so you think I should be talking about gratitude and Thanksgiving, but I'm going to take a little different approach today. And I'm going to offer this confession. I've been a Christian for about 30 years, and it took me about 30 years to recognize hope. If I'm honest, every time I read the New Testament, I would sort of gloss over hope. Faith, yeah, I think a little, I know that is a little bit. Love, yeah, I'm starting to learn just a bit. But hope, really, what's going on there? So I'd gloss over it in many, many ways. And 10 years ago, if you would have asked me, Jason, what are you hoping for? I probably would have responded by saying, Lord, I want a great marriage, great kids, and great ministry. Great marriage, great kids, and great ministry. And if you were my spiritual director 10 years ago, you could have asked me a question, Jason, to what degree are you hoping for just great blessings or great fulfillment in life? And how much are you really hoping in God? I was sitting on the edge of my seat, sort of waiting for these blessings to come in, almost demanding, Lord, you owe me. And so if I'm honest, I really never hoped. But hope has been boiling up in ways the last few months, and ways that are new for me, new for on the Godward side of birthing something that's thirstier for who God is than for His blessings. Great marriage, great kids, great ministry. I would have said to you, if you were my spiritual director 10 years ago, aren't these worthy things? Aren't these worthy recipients of my hope? And if you were a good spiritual director, you might have pointed out that, Jason, when you hope and need for these things in the way that you're doing, gratitude slowly leaks out of your life like an old balloon. Because you're focusing not on what God has given you, but on what you have not yet got. And so I have seen God bubbling forth in my soul these last couple months, a renewed sense of hope in ways that are deeper, ways that are pure, and ways that draw me more into who God is than ever before. And 10 years ago, I would never seen it like this, but when I open our passage of Scripture today in Matthew chapter 7, I see 3 ways that I want to be about hope. I'm going to share them with you this morning. Turn your Bibles with me to Matthew chapter 7. We'll be reading verses 7 through 12. Jesus says, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. To the one who knocks it will be opened. Which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? If he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask Him? So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. This is the Word of God. I'm starting to ask questions like this. How many of my hopes are centered on God? Starting to ask questions like this. How many of my hopes are centered around being the child of God that I long to be? You see, those hopes and those answers to those questions are answered in very different type of ways and result in a very different type of rest and follow a very different pursuit in life. And so I see three great hopes for my life and for yours here when I read this passage. I find myself praying this: Lord, won't you make me a simple person of prayer? Won't you make me a person who receives what God gives? And Lord, won't you make me a person who loves with a passionate imagination? These are hopes centered not on what I can get from God, but what God can get into me and get into my soul. First, the hope to be a simple person of prayer. My middle son, Jackson, has two great friends right across the street, Choo-Choo and Gio. The problem is that Choo-Choo and Gio are a little bit busier than Jackson. And so both Choo-Choo and Gio have extended family in the area, whereas Jackson does not. Their family has a boat, which Jackson does not. And so every time that Choo-Choo and Gio are home, we will know it because Jackson, right there in the living room, will say, Choo-Choo and Gio are here, Choo-Choo and Gio are here, and rush right out the door, slam the door, rush right across the street, knock on the door. Now, his older brother has gotten whiff of this and likes to torment him. So sometimes Kenyon, our 14-year-old, will look from the couch, faintly look across the street and say, Choo-Choo and Gio are here, which then Jackson will jump up and bum rush their house only to discover, no, you have been tricked by your older brother. And so Jackson loves to ask and seek and knock. Sometimes, though, the parents, as we want to say, Jackson, can you at least allow the family to get out of their vehicle before you go over? Right? And so all this persistent asking and seeking and knocking on our neighbor's door, we will say, whoa, this might be considered a little bit rude. Calm down, buddy. This is what our initial inclination is as parents. But what does Jesus say in our passage? He says simple asking, simple seeking, and simple knocking is actually the way that God delights for you to live. God delights for you to rush out of the house so excited to see your friends. And so in this passage, don't you hear Jesus, in a sense, clearing out all the obstacles for you to come to the Father? John Calvin said, "For nothing is better adapted to excite us to prayer than a full conviction that we shall be heard." And so I ask you today, do you truly believe that God opens the door for those who knock? That God is found when you seek Him? That simple asking should be a way of life before God, not a last resort. In other words, do you find yourself coming alive to the notion, Lord, won't you make me a simple person of prayer? Maybe my hope is not only in, good marriage and good kids and good ministry, and maybe you have different hopes that you could define in your own ways. Maybe good enough health and good enough money to pay the rent and good enough kids and good enough grandkids. But is there something deeper that you might hope for? Lord, make me a simple person of prayer. Dale Bruner puts it like this. He says, even we Christians carry around heavy bundles of wishes that never become asking. We talk to ourselves about our problems in the form of much thought and worry and sleeplessness. We might even talk about our problem with those close to us too, but even we Christians are strangely reluctant to talk about our problems with the Father. And so I asked myself, Jason, is one of the hopes you're cultivating in life not simply about a good marriage and a good ministry and good kids, but around aspirations to lead a prayerful life? How about you? If you could list your hope, does an aspirational, Lord, make me a prayerful person, a simple prayerful person, bubble to the surface of your soul in ways that attracts you to what God might do in your life? Might we even pray together this morning, Lord, it's not too late for you to make me a simple person of prayer. What I'm most thirsty for, O Lord, is to be a man or is to be a woman of prayer. But strangely enough, when we look out into our world, don't we often find and think, if we don't even say it to others, that we sometimes think that prayer is really unnecessary? Why ask? Why seek? Why knock? Because if we're honest, we look out in the world and conclude, actually the folks who don't pray sometimes live better than the folks who do pray. And when I was in Africa, I often asked myself, why is it that the people that I am with now in Equatorial Guinea, these people who I have known in my life that are most, have their souls treaded to God in prayer, have the least of any other people I've known in the world? God, what are you doing in that? If we're honest, we sometimes think, and rightly so, that lots of things happen for lots of people in our world without prayer. So is prayer really necessary? Why should I hope to be a simple person of prayer if I can live a very successful life without it? Think of the unprayerful farmer. The farmer that doesn't pray still gets his crop through his sweat and labor, not by his prayer. Think of the mother who rejects God. This unprayerful mother still receives her baby through medical expertise, not by prayer. Think of the family who manages its budget and works hard and saves well. They do all those things not by prayer, but by hard work. So why should I be hopeful deep in my soul to live a prayerful life if it doesn't make any difference? And here's where we need to distinguish, I think, the creation gifts that God gives as a creator and the redemption gifts that God gives as a father. You see, creation gifts are given to all. Remember Jesus in this very same Sermon on the Mount, in the chapter 5, what does Jesus say? He says that God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the what? On the just and the unjust. And so God, as creator, often gives his gift indiscriminately to all. He often gives life and harvests and babies and wages to many people who even reject that he exists. And so even in the Sermon on the Mount, yes, you are encouraged to pray, give us this day our daily bread, as you practice gratitude, as you acknowledge God as your creator and provider and sustainer. But does that mean that God doesn't feed like half the earth that never prays at once for their food? No. Creation gifts are given to all, not so gifts of redemption. Not so the gifts that God bestows upon His children as a father. Paul says this in Romans chapter 10, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." In other words, ask, seek, and knock, and you shall be saved. In the same passage in Romans 10, Paul concludes, "For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing His riches on all who call on Him." So the gift of salvation, the gift of Christ likeness in our sanctification, the gifts of the Christian life, of peace, of forgiveness, of becoming a generous soul, of faith, the gift of prayer. These are good gifts from the Father that are redemptive gifts. And people of God, these gifts are only given to those who ask for them, those who call upon the Lord, those who live a simple life of prayer by simple asking, simple seeking, and simple knocking. So is something burning in your soul? Lord, I don't want to be satisfied only with creation gifts. Lord, I want to be the kind of disciple. I want to be the kind of Christian that looks for and seeks redemptive gifts. Christ-likeness, the character of Christ, becoming a forgiving soul, becoming a generous person, becoming a prayerful person. These things you should ask for in prayer before your Father. Isaiah 65:1 says, and this is God talking, God says, "I was ready to be sought by those who did not ask for me. I was ready to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am to a nation that was not called by my name." And so the question, of course, is how much more is the Lord sought by those of us who know Him as Father, that have the indwelling Spirit, that know the beloved Son. James 4:2 says it very simply, "You do not have because you do not ask." And so I ask you, where is your hope? Have you been like me, sort of living on the edge of your seat? Lord, these are the things I want. I deserve them. I'm going to demand them from you until you give them to me. And was I living more as an entitled self or more as a demanding soul? Was I demanding from God creation gifts where maybe I should seek redemptive gifts? Do you hope to be rich in the grace of God, rich in the spiritual life? Then you also must hope to live a simple life of prayer. So that's the first hope. Lord, make me a simple person of prayer. In our most honest moments, don't you find that bubbling up inside your soul to be a hopeful person of prayer? Lord, make me that kind of person. The second hope that I see in the passage is to be the kind of person who receives what God gives. Look at verses 9 through 11. And I want to ask you the question, do you know where Lucifer went wrong? You said, "Pastor, that's a big question for so early in the morning." Do you know where Lucifer went wrong? Here's my best guess. Lucifer wasn't content with the place and the position and the gifts that God had given him. And so I ask myself, am I the type of person that receives what God gives me? Or do I have trust issues? In 2010 to 2013, I received a PhD in world Christianity from the University of Edinburgh. The thought was to specialize in Africa, to open up the entire continent so that I could teach and preach and raise up leaders in colleges and seminaries all across Africa. And so I sometimes wonder, God, here I am in Florida. Why did I study that? I could have studied, systematic theology and impressed this congregation with lots of big theologians. And some of you are thinking, Thank God you didn't study that. But I ask, myself, what were those years? Were those wasted years? Can I trust that God always gives good gifts? I hope I can. I hope I am. 7 years ago, God gave us Tristan on Christmas Eve. About 3.5 years ago, Tristan was diagnosed with autism. To say this has been a journey is to give a big understatement. Can I trust that God always gives good gifts? I hope I can. I hope I am. Is there something bubbling up in your soul to be grateful and thankful for the gifts that you have been given, instead of focusing on the ones that have not yet been given? What's your basic posture in life? Do you despair or complain or dwell on the things you wish you had in life? Or are you a person who receives what God gives? One way, receiving what God gives you, is the way of Christ, is the way of the cross. Being discontent for what the position and the place and the gifts that God's given you, that's the way of Lucifer. How wide is the gap? And so I hope that I am one who receives what God has given me. And in this passage, I think Jesus is trying to convince you of something very, very important. And it's this: God always gives good gifts. God always gives good gifts. Can you trust in the goodness of God? Or do you have trust issues like I often have trust issues? Jesus is saying this, that if you ask for bread, God is never, ever going to give you a stone. And that if you ask for a fish, God is never content to say, well, I'll just give you something scaly just like a fish. Here, take a serpent. God never does that. All His gifts are good gifts. But you could say, maybe like I could say, well, if you got a moment, and I just need a moment, I'm going to tell you about some stones and some serpents in my life. I have prayed and prayed and prayed, and God hasn't responded yet. It would make perfect sense to me that God would answer this prayer. What is going on? Let me tell you that sometimes in this fallen world, we can't easily distinguish the good gifts of God. And sometimes we don't often understand that life was designed not to make you happy, but to make you holy. And sometimes the good gifts that make you holy are quite distinct from the gifts that you think you need to make you happy. The gifts that God gives are always good gifts. Do you have trust issues in the goodness of God? The comparison that Jesus uses to drive home the point is not, hey, some of you have good parents. Just think how much greater God's goodness is and God's gifts are than your good parents. No, He starts with not the goodness of mankind, but the evil mankind. Hey, you all have evil, fallen parents, but even they have given you some good gifts. Calvin says God drops into their hearts, talking of evil parents, a portion of His goodness. And so there is a much more so in this passage that emphasizes the sheer incomprehensibility of God's goodness. The goodness of God that always delights to give good gifts to His children. Am I one that receives what God gives, or always focuses on what I have not yet been given? Am I treading the way of Jesus and His cross? Or am I following the way of Lucifer? It's a big question. If in verse 7 and 8 Jesus is saying God does not like to play hide and seek, He always longs and likes to be found in prayer. Here Jesus is saying something a little different, that God is generous beyond all measure. That those who ask Him, how much more, He says, will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who what? Who ask Him. So ask away. But if you only ask for creation gifts, and you never ask for redemption gifts, you're only hoping for second things. What are you more thirsty for? If God would give everything that you hoped for, but He can do that without ever showing up, is that true hope? Where will my attention be? With what God hasn't given me or with what God has given me? And the manner you answer that question will determine both your level of gratitude and your level of joy. The third hope I find in this passage is also a hope that has begun to stir in my own soul. That is, I'm hoping to be a person who loves with passionate imagination. And if I'm honest, I'd settle for most days for simply being a person who loves with imagination. Without even the passion, right? In my own marriage, I am very, very aware of all the ways I fall short of loving my wife. But at the top of that long list is what can be termed acts of service in order to love my wife in her love language. Because it seems to me that Lisa lives into these acts of service almost effortlessly. She sees a need, she acts to serve and meet the need. Lisa gets a 10 for compassion, a 10 for empathy, and a 10 for sacrificial love. Me, not so much. And the way that she loves Tristan, our son with autism, shows me Jesus almost every single day. And so you say, Pastor, I think you have a lot to learn from your wife, and you'd be right. But I also have a hope that's been bubbling up in my soul the last several months to be the kind of husband that raises the bar on my own acts of service. The kind of husband that doesn't have to wait for his wife to tell him what to do while he is sitting on the couch, right? But is imaginative in my desires to serve and love my wife. Don't you think this is part of what Jesus is getting at in the golden rule? Look at verse 12 again. He says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Or in the NIV it says, do to others what you would have them do to you. Or in the Message version of the Bible, ask yourself what you want people to do for you, then grab the initiative and do it for them. And so when I put my hopes for a good marriage, good kids, and good ministry on this side, and my hope to be the kind of husband, the kind of friend, the kind of pastor who imaginatively walks the way of love, what do you think is more focused on self? What do you think is more focused on God and being the kind of child that God longs for me to be? Is one of your hopes in life to love with imagination? To maybe go down a little bit further down the road and down the path of love? A lack of imagination is a lack of love. The golden rule is a call to creativity in the way of love. And before this week, I got to be honest, I never viewed the golden rule as a rebuke to my love, as exposing something sinful in me, in my lack of imagination in love. And yet there it is, the golden rule, not only asking me to be kind, which I'm sure it is doing that, but also rebuking me for my lack of imagination in the ways of love. How much I have a deficit in the ways of sacrificial love. Can you hope to to be a person characterized by imaginative, passionate love. It's often been said that people from Confucius to Old Testament rabbis to the philosopher Immanuel Kant always gave the negative form of the golden rule. That is, they always said, do not do unto others what you don't want them doing to you. And you see, the negative form of the golden rule is always less demanding. It always just prohibits action. But Jesus taught in the golden rule that love is limited. And limited only by your imagination of how you might serve and love those around you. And so if you long to be a person who walks in the ways of love, you're going to ask God, God, give me a greater imagination to serve and sacrifice for love for those you've placed around me. One last point. There's a connecting link between verse 11 and 12. It's a small conjunction that introduces verse 12. It can be translated as therefore or so then. And so there is a link between verses 11 and 12. What do you think that link is in Jesus' mind? I think the link between those two verses is one of generosity. Verse 11, Jesus says, look how generous the Father is in giving you good things. God only gives good things to His children. Then He says, verse 12, therefore, so then you too, in other words, should be generous. Whatever you wish would be done to you. That's what you do to others. That's the way of love. Can you be generous walking down the way of love? Or does somebody always have to prod you? Does someone always have to yell at you and force you and guilt you in to being the type of generous soul and generous lover that you are called to be with those around you? It took me 30 years in the Christian life to understand hope. And I finally recognized that these things that I was hoping for, they weren't hope. There's hope that is always hope deferred. I was wanting fulfillment right now in life. What hope is there in that? And so is there bubbling up in your soul, as I hope it is in mine? Lord, I hope to be a simple person of prayer. That's what's most alive within me. I want to be a person who receives what you give. Not always focusing on what you don't give. And I want to be a person who walks the way of Christ, walks the way of love, walks the way of passionate imagination in my love. And if I know our congregation well, and I think I do, I know that that is also bubbling forth in your life. Let's pray.